In this video we're going to look at the APIR process, the Assess, Plan, Implement and Review process. I've chosen a chain metaphor because, as we know, a weak link in the chain affects the strength of the rest of the chain. In other words, a weak assessment necessarily leads to a weak plan, a weak implementation and a consequently weak review. I first came across APIR when working for the Connection Service in the early 2000s. However, APIR has now been adopted by other agencies for a systematic process of working with families and trying to effect change. The supporting material behind this presentation can be found in Thomson's 2009 text People Skills, and if you want a fuller account of APIR you can consult Parker and Bradley's text, now in its 4th edition in 2014 from the Learning Matters publisher. So first of all, let's have a look at an assessment. What is an assessment? Well, it's a process of gathering information, and essentially it takes place in two realms. First of all, from secondary sources, i.e. the opinions of others or the written down opinions of others found in reports and previous assessments, and it can take place directly from our own senses, i.e. observations or what families say to us in person. And both of those things can contribute towards an assessment. However, Thomson goes on to advocate that information gathering in assessments should be minimum necessary, not maximum available. And this is essentially answers the question, how much information is enough? When do we call it a day? When do we consider that we have enough information to make reasonable judgments and a plan about a family? The reason why assessment should be minimal is that to ensure minimal intrusion into private family life, unnecessary interfering if you like, to avoid wasting time collecting endless amounts of data which might not ultimately be used, and finally to avoid information overload on the part of the practitioner. Ultimately, one has to use the information in a pragmatic manner. In undertaking an assessment, it is essential that we define the problem in as much detail as necessary before we seek solutions. And often, when we seek to help someone, we'll often come up with premature solutions to that person's problem. And that's out of a desire to help rather than a full understanding of what the complex issues are that are facing those individuals. Thomson goes on to state that assessments should be partnership based, not paternalistic. Why do you think that's the case? Would you prefer to work alongside someone, or would you prefer to have someone coming in and telling you what to do? Secondly, we'll look at this in more detail in terms of ecological context, that assessment should assess situations and not people. Who would like to think that them as a person was being assessed? Assessment should look at strengths as well as deficits within families. Why is it important to look at strengths? Well, you can think in terms of motivation. If you've ever needed to change, what's motivated you? Someone pointing out where your deficits are, or someone pointing out what you do well and hoping that we can build on what it is that you do well. Assessment should look at significant changes that take place, because significant changes can affect the plan as was originally envisaged, and also the effectiveness of implementing that plan. Assessment should respond to need and not demand, and that requires that the practitioner has confidence in their ability to accurately assess a family based on its needs, not necessarily who is shouting loudest in that family. Assessment should be confidential. Assessment should separate fact from opinion. It's fine to give your opinion in an assessment, however it must be identified as such. And a professional opinion, of course, is valid, because a professional opinion is informed by expertise, experience and research on the matter, theory. Assessment should avoid jargon, and that's to avoid communication mishaps. Assessment should avoid vagueness. As I said originally, that if one has a vague plan, a vague assessment, or a weak link in the chain, the following plan and implementation will be weak and vague. And finally, that the assessment and plan should set clear objectives and timescales. And this is to avoid drift. You might have a very good relationship with a family and to some extent enjoy working with a family, but if you're not affecting a change, an identified necessary change in that family, you have to ask yourself, why are you actually working with them? Are you there for their needs, or are you there for your needs? So it's important that we are clear on what we are seeking to achieve with the family and set a time limitation on that. When we assess situations rather than people, the theory base that informs this is ecological theory, the ecological context of a family. And some key theorists here are Belsky from 1984 in his Determinants of Parenting, Bronfenbrenner's 79 ecological theory, and Thompson's more recent PCS analysis. And we can see some evidence of those three theories here in this diagram in the middle, with the child in the centre of their ecological world, affected by the family, the community, childcare, social, political and cultural factors. And you can read more about those three theories in more detail. So once we have an understanding of the child's ecological context and what needs to change, we need to make a plan. All a plan is a understanding of where we are in the present state, the assessment of where we are now, point A, and where it is that we're hoping or want to get to, point B. And it'd be nice if all plans followed the bottom trajectory of a straight line from A to B, but actually, because working with children and families is complex, it's more likely to look like the higher diagram. But as long as we achieve the objectives that we set out to achieve, the plan can be considered to be effective. When making a plan, it might be useful to think of SMART goals, SMART objectives, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant and time-bound. But actually in constructing that plan, it's often useful to rearrange the letters so that we begin with what it is that we want to measure. So MAST sometimes can be more helpful than SMART as an acronym for setting goals and objectives. So what might we be considering for objectives? Well, in terms of social work and family support, the Assessment Framework 2000 from the Department of Health, the Assessment Triangle, or the Assessment of Children in Need and Their Families, outlines 3 domains of what might be considered objectives. So, for example, we might consider in our assessment that the parent is not demonstrating reasonable emotional warmth towards their children within their parenting capacity. So we might make a plan that is designed to address the objective of increasing parental emotional warmth towards their children. And this framework for assessment influenced a number of other assessments subsequently, such as the CAF, the Common Assessment Framework from 2006, that many of you might already be working with. What the framework of assessment does, whether the full assessment there or the Common Assessment Framework or other allied assessment does, it provides a systematic approach for assessing families. It provides a conceptual map for understanding families, and it also provides consistency between practitioners. People aren't generating their own random objectives, although sometimes these might be useful and reasonable for a family. The assessment framework requires a thorough understanding of the 3 interrelated domains: the developmental needs of children, the capacities of caregivers to meet those needs, the impact of wider environmental factors. And I remember when I did my first assessments as a social worker, I used to go out with the paper documentation because I was unsure of the different categories, and I used to work through the form. But as I became more experienced, I could undertake the assessment essentially in my head. I had a representation, a conceptual map of the framework in my head, and making minimal notes with the family. And this enabled me to engage much more fully with the family. In fact, I remember once being almost ejected from a council building because the practitioners from another department thought I was a member of an unruly family. But actually I was engaged in this assessment process, but much of the assessment was taking place in my head, in the conceptual map of the triangle. After we've undertaken our full assessment and we've put together a SMART or MAST plan, it comes to the stage of implementing that plan, the doing, what we need to do to get to point A to point B. And that might be in its series of practical tasks that we set for families or practical tasks that we are involved with. After we've undertaken this A assessment, P, planning, I, implementation, it's then necessary to review how successful we've been at each one of the stages. So some concluding points about the APIR process. Firstly, assessment is a complex process obtaining information about children and families. As we can see, if we use the assessment triangle and we're informed by theories such as Bronfenbrenner, Belsky and Thompson, we can necessarily appreciate how complex assessing families can be. This information gathering assessment is necessary to build an accurate picture of children's needs and any risks to their development, as informed by the Children Act 1989, Section 17 and Section 47. This assessment includes judgments about what is reasonable to be expected for children or comparable children. This reasonableness is based on research on children's ecological development. This assessment then informs the plan, which ought to be SMART, and then this plan is merely a recipe or a roadmap of moving from where we are now, point A, to where we would like to be, point B. And to achieve the plan, we have to implement it. How successful were we at addressing the needs identified in the assessment? How successful were we at putting together a SMART or MAST plan? How successful were we at ultimately implementing that plan? This brings us to the final stage in the process, the review. And those judgments about how effective is the assessment, the plan and the implementation should be considered in the review. The review can be recorded in a formal written document, but ongoing review is also possible. Although scheduled at the end of a time-limited phase of assessment, planning and implementation, we can choose to enter the review stage at any point if elements of the assessment, the plan or the implementation is not effective. So we might need to review the assessment as being perhaps not as accurate as it might have been initially. We might need to review the plan, that certain elements are no longer possible or achievable or measurable, and we might have to review our own implementation of that plan. What are we doing? Is it being effective?